You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Past Macabre. I'm your host, Stephanie Rice, and after a brief hiatus, I've returned to journey through history with you to uncover how our relationship with death reflects the values, fears, and hopes that shape the way people live. Thanks for joining me for episode 16, The Kingdom of Pylos, Warrior Princes of Mycenean Greece. On Friday, June 27th, this Friday, I have the opportunity to do a live stream of the opening day for the Kingdom of Pylos exhibit at the Getty Villa. It will be on the Archaeology Podcast Network Discord server, so be sure to check out social media for how to join. The opening day of the exhibit will also be the grand reopening day of the Getty Villa for the first time since the Palisades fire in January, so I'm very excited to be back. So for this episode, I wanted to provide some context for the exhibit. So I'll share a little bit about the Mycenaeans overall, and of course give some information about the star of the exhibit, the Griffin Warrior. His grave was discovered completely intact in 2015. And this was one of those discoveries that actually did stun archaeologists and change a lot of what we knew about the time period. We'll delve into Homer's mythical version of Pylos and King Nestor, and then we'll explore the historical Pylos and the archaeological site known as the Palace of Nestor. The artifacts that will be on display at the exhibit while I'm doing my walkthrough will be from tombs around the palace, so that's why I wanted to give this context so that we can look at the artifacts instead of spending a lot of the live stream on the culture and the time period. So now let's explore the world of the Griffin Warrior in Mycenean Greece during the late Bronze Age. Let's start with a little bit of background about the Mycenaeans. They appeared in the archaeological record as a uniquely identifiable culture around 1750 BCE. We call them Mycenaeans because the city of Mycenae was the first site that the culture was identified at, and it was clearly a major center of power based on the size and artifacts found there. However, it wasn't what we would consider like a capital city or anything like that. It wasn't the central place for Mycenaean politics or economy or anything like that. What it was a central part of a city-state, and Mycenae as in the Mycenaean civilization, was a collection of city-states with very similar cultural and religious beliefs. Very similar to Greek city-states in classical Greece. There's some debate amongst scholars about what the Mycenaeans called themselves, because Greek classical writers called them the Achaeans and the Danaoi interchangeably, and then the ancient Egyptian records refer to the Danaou people of the area that we call Mycenae, and the Hittites referred to the Ahiawa, who many scholars think were the Mycenaeans based on some of the descriptions that were provided in the Hittite texts. One single Linear B tablet found on Crete details a shipment of goods that was bound for mainland Greece that are labeled to Achaea, but no more have been found yet that actually confirm. Now, Linear B was the language that the Mycenaeans wrote in, and so that does point to the fact that they may have called themselves the Achaeans, but more of these types of tablets or other sort of definitive evidence would need to be found in order to prove that conclusively. They were the predecessors to classical Greece, as is most commonly recognized of the region and the ancient periods. And the Mycenaeans created the first written form of Greek, known as Linear B, as I already mentioned. And this was the first version of the written Greek language. So the Mycenaeans would have spoken Greek or ancient Greek. And this Linear B language came first before the later classical Greeks gained the Phoenician alphabet and their letters changed to what we recognize now. Many of the Mycenaean deities and myths are the foundation for many of the classical Greek myths, and more information on that is in episode 9, Chthonic Mysteries of Greece, which is part of the Gods and Goddesses of Death series, so I won't go too deeply into it now, or else we'll be here for a while. The Mycenaeans were a major power in Greece until the Late Bronze Age collapse, which happened around 1200 to 1100 BCE. Now, the Late Bronze Age collapse, just to quickly give an overview of a very complex period, it was a time of major climate change, plague, political upheaval, warfare, and mass refugee migrations that caused a long period of instability, and many of the ancient civilizations collapsed around the same period because of all of this. For the climate change aspect, tree ring samples in Anatolia show evidence of a multi-year drought, and that's provided evidence that a lot of the wider region likely also experienced that as well. And there's evidence that water levels in some of the fresh water sources in the region dropped as much as 50 meters below the average across the entire region around 1200 BCE, which again is another sign of long droughts. And geological research has shown that a volcanic eruption that we call Hekla 3 in Iceland, long before Iceland was even discovered by humans, caused a volcanic winter that dropped temperatures across the global north for 18 years. So this would have also impacted the way that crops grew. Any that might have been drought resistant would have likely struggled with the colder temperatures. More information on all of this is found in episode 5, Entrances to the Underworld, especially if you want to learn more about Hekla, who is one of the largest volcanoes in Iceland. I say who like it's a person. It's one of the largest volcanoes in Iceland, and it's considered an entrance to the underworld because of its massive destruction. And as far as plagues go, archaeologists have found evidence of bacteria related to bubonic plague at several sites across Late Bronze Age Greece and Anatolia. This strain is extinct now, but there's enough samples that go to show that it was very likely a factor in a lot of the changes that were happening during this period. There are major cities across the entire region that were very important centers for quite a while that show destruction layers where portions or even entire cities were completely destroyed roughly around the same period. And there were also cities that were just completely abandoned, with some evidence that this was after quite a large decline after several decades. And Pylos was one of these cities that was destroyed during this period. Homer wrote about Pylos in the Iliad and the Odyssey. It was home to the mythical King Nestor, according to him, and Nestor was one of the Argonauts who joined Jason on his epic adventures. Nestor was the youngest of 12, and he wasn't in line to be king at all, but then Heracles killed his father and his brothers because the king, Nailas, refused to pardon Heracles' blood debt, ironically. So Heracles was already in trouble for killing someone close to the king, and so he chose to kill the king and most of the people close to him. Heracles in myths was a very bloody, very violent person very often. And according to Homer, Nestor was given the lifespan of his siblings who died because the gods felt that it was very messed up that Heracles did this. Apollo specifically was one of the gods that was heavily worshipped by the king Nailas, who was Nestor's father, and so he bestowed a lot of gifts upon Nestor in honor of that. In the Iliad, Nestor and 2 of his sons fought in the Trojan War, though Nestor was already very old by this period and had lived for several generations, again, because he gained the lifespan of his siblings. And so he was seen as a wise advisor more than a fighter in the Iliad. In the Odyssey, he's still not a fighter, but he's no longer in the war zone. Odysseus' son, Telemachus, goes to Nestor at Pylos for help finding Odysseus. Nestor is again depicted as very wise, and he provides Telemachus with quite a lot of wisdom and advice on how he can go about his search, because unfortunately, Nestor had no idea what had happened to Odysseus at the end of the Trojan War. And Nestor chose to send one of his sons to assist Telemachus on his search so that Telemachus wouldn't be completely left in the dark without Nestor or any help from Pylos. The Iliad and the Odyssey were likely inspired by real-life places and events. We know Pylos exists, but we don't have evidence of Nestor specifically by that name, though there are very grand tombs for elites and royals that show that they were heavily revered during their time. But there is a lot of cool research that's shown that Homer's epics contain fragments of Mycenaean stories and myths. So that goes to show, with a lot of evidence combined that would take an entire episode of itself to prove, that a lot of these tales that Homer was retelling, while the broad information likely came from historical facts that happened at the end of the Late Bronze Age, which was about 4 centuries before Homer wrote these epics. It's likely that he was preserving the oral stories that were passed down during the Greek Dark Ages, which was the period after the Late Bronze Age collapse until the archaic Greece started in about 800 BCE. So one of the things that's very interesting about the Iliad and the Odyssey is that we can track a lot of the real places that Homer mentions and separate the facts from the myths as best as we can. He didn't likely get exact people correct, or if he got little bits of real people, they were all combined into one hero. But it is interesting to be able to find the locations that he speaks about. Troy is also a real place, the place where the Trojan War happened. And it's a real archaeological site that's in modern day Turkey. In Anatolia was what it was called at the time. The Kingdom of Pylos, as Homer called it, or really the region that the city-state controlled, covered an area of roughly 2,000 kilometers squared, or 770 square miles, from what we can tell from the archaeological record. Linear B tablets found confirmed the Mycenaeans did call it Pylos, and at least one tablet naming Pylos will be at the exhibit at the Getty Villa. I'm actually really excited to see all of the Linear B tablets. Obviously, all of the treasures will be great too, but I'm a bit of a nerd. And as I said before, the Mycenaean culture was a large collection of city-states, and so Pylos was a political unit that was mostly isolated when it came to its own decisions within the larger Mycenaean region. It was like a mix of feudalism and the Greek city-state structure, because the land was controlled by the city-state and there were landlords essentially, to, again, summarize a very complex system. It was similar to Sparta or Athens in the classical periods as we know them through the most common tales that are told today about them. There would be periods when all of the city-states would be allies. There would be periods when some of the city-states were allying against one another. So it wasn't one single unified political entity all of the time. Based on the Linear B tablets, the population of the entire controlled region of Pylos was a minimum of 50,000 people, and the population fluctuated close to 120,000 people at some points. So it likely would have depended on all sorts of factors, whether there were large mass migrations that were already happening during this period, or possibly even a seasonal thing where just during certain seasons there were more traders coming through, or workmen during specific projects. Again, that could be an entire episode of itself. And so Pylos was very clearly a major center for Mycenaean culture during the Late Bronze Age, though it wasn't quite as big as Mycenae was. It's in modern-day Messenia, by the way, which is in the southwest Peloponnese region of Greece. So just to give you a little bit of geographical context here as well. The artifacts that will be on display at the Getty come from an archaeological site known as the Palace of Nestor. Now, it's named that by archaeologists because, as I said, Nestor's existence is debatable. We don't have any archaeological record of any ruler by that name, but it's possible it's a very changed version of what it once was, considering Homer was writing these centuries after the Mycenaean culture had already faded away. The Palace of Nestor is the best preserved example of a Mycenaean palace that's been found so far. The top layer that everyone can visit today, it's a tourism site in Greece, was the final phase of this site, which was built around 1300 BCE. Further excavations underneath that, though, show earlier buildings, and the area around the palace has tombs that date back to at least 1700 BCE. And a side cool thing at this site is one of the earliest examples of a tholos tomb, which is a beehive tomb, was found here. And these were communal graves that were used for many generations for either the royal family or elites. It's often hard to tell because these were looted so heavily in antiquity. And they're dome-shaped buildings that are shaped like beehives, hence the colloquial name in English, beehive tombs. These tombs are really cool with their architecture style and the engineering behind it because they're built with a method called corbelling, which is where large stones are laid so that each layer hangs out over the previous layer, but the stones are large enough and the way that they're laid allows it to be built with no mortar at all, and yet they last for millennia. These corbelled domes would have then been covered with dirt and then only accessible by a stone-lined entrance passage, which would have aided in the preservation of the walls and the domed ceiling. Unfortunately, though, they were still a bit obvious even when they were covered by dirt, so almost all of them that have been found were already looted centuries, if not thousands of years ago. Possibly around the late Bronze Age collapse, if not even during the Mycenaean period. It was not uncommon for people in the ancient period to loot the tombs of people who came even for longer before them. Now, the Palace of Nestor was very clearly the center of power for the Pylos city-state. The Wanaks, or king, that's what they called themselves, ruled from here, and it did have the typical palace stuff. It was 2 stories of the main construction, and there was a formal throne room and a royal residence, and then quarters for the high-ranking officials, like especially ultimately the general who would have been in charge of the majority of the military, to, again, simplify a complex position. And then there was a very awesome example of a Mycenaean bath that was fairly well preserved, and I will be sure to share a picture of that on Instagram because I think it's cool. And there were beautiful wall murals all over this palace, and there's evidence of very large feasts that happened here as well. So it wasn't like the king was just holed up here away and separate from the people. At the very least, elites came over for these huge feasts. And there were over 2,000 cups found in one storeroom alone. And the throne room itself had a massive hearth in the center of it, which there's evidence that there were animal remains in there that were essentially cremated, but due to cooking fires, not intentionally like a full animal cremation burial type of thing. And so it was likely that these feasts were held on major religious occasions or possibly even major diplomatic meetings. It was also the administrative center for Pylos, not just living quarters. And this is where the Linear B tablets were found that documented the agricultural economy of the area. And luckily for us, they were preserved because the palace was burnt down later. Otherwise, they would have just been regular clay tablets that would have eventually succumbed to the elements, if not intentionally molded back into a new tablet over time. And there were also large storerooms around the palace for trade goods, not just goods that were meant to supply the palace. They were labeled for trade, again, showing that this was an administrative and economic center. And they held large amounts of oil and wine and grain, so they were very well built so that they could withstand any sort of like rodents, pests in general, like insects and stuff, the elements and things like that. There were also workshops found here where perfumes were made, most likely for ritual purposes or something within temple use. That's what we see in ancient Egypt, at least, and that is more my wheelhouse. So that could just be an assumption on my part, but it wasn't very likely that the perfumes were being made for common economic consumption. There was also metalworking workshops, smithies, there that were making all sorts of things. It was like weaponry, everyday items like tools and jewelry, and all sorts of metal goods that were going not only to use there within the palace, but also they were going out to be traded outside of Pylos. There were also a lot of masonry workshops, whether they were stoneworking or marble working, and Pylos had a sewer system, like an actual sewer system that would be exactly like what we have today, just made of different materials and possibly not quite as big depending on what city you're in. And the sewer system is awesome, which sounds weird, because it shows that the city, or at the very least the palace and everything immediately around it, was a planned layout with advanced infrastructure that would have taken a lot of time to design and build. And there would have been prototypes elsewhere. While we haven't specifically found them, there's no way that they would have just suddenly known how to build a sewer system when they came to build the Palace of Nestor. And the palace was, unfortunately, as I said, destroyed by a fire around 1200 BCE. And it was great for us as archaeologists because we have the Linear B tablets preserved because of that. But it is likely that this was part of the larger Bronze Age collapse that was going on during the period. And there's some evidence that pieces of the countryside around Pylos were already abandoned. So it was likely that the centralized palace was starting to lose power. People were migrating, and there was all sorts of unrest during the period. And then eventually they made it to the actual palace. They, as in whoever ended up burning it down. It's possible that maybe this or something similar is the conflict that inspired the myth of Heracles killing the previous king and all of Nestor's siblings. It's possible that these sorts of events have been actually preserved in a lot of the myths that we now have today. But again, as I said, all attributed to a single hero instead of multiple people experiencing it across several centuries. Excavations at the Palace of Nestor have been going on since the 1930s, off and on, not consistently, and they're still ongoing today. One of the biggest finds that came from the Palace of Nestor, or the region around it technically, actually came to us in 2015, and it's what's known as the grave of the Griffin Warrior. And a lot of the artifacts that are going to be on display at the Getty Villa exhibition are from the grave of the Griffin Warrior. And that's because it was completely untouched. And so that means there were tons of treasures left behind. It allows us to get a more complete picture of the time period, though obviously a single snapshot is not going to be as good as if we were to have multiple examples. But what's very interesting about this is he was very clearly important. If not a king, he was definitely a high-ranking elite or military commander, especially. Most other Mycenaean tombs were looted, and so we only get a small glimpse of the burial goods, especially like any of the treasures that are going to be gone. But even still, kind of assuming what would have been taken, archaeologists were completely taken aback by the amount of treasures that were found in the Griffin Warrior tomb. And I know that is a very common headline: archaeologists shocked, archaeologists baffled, et cetera, but this is one of the few discoveries that actually did change the way we looked at things, because it provided way more cultural information than we had ever previously had in one spot with one person. The Griffin Warrior was buried in a shaft grave, which was lined with stones and then sealed with a massive cover stone. The shaft was dug into the ground. It was a solo tomb, too, which was rare for the period. By this time, the Tholos tombs, which were communal, were already in use, even for kings and elites. This tomb dates to about 1450 BCE, so it's from before the Palace of Nestor was built. But like I said, we have evidence that this was a very important site for a long period before what we know as the Palace of Nestor came to be in about 1300 BCE. And one of the very cool things is that the artifacts that were found in the Griffin Warrior tomb, I keep saying one of the cool things, there are so many cool things, but they show earlier evidence of Minoan contact, like complex Minoan contact with trade and probably already military skirmishes happening between the two than was previously expected. Now, we do know that the Mycenaeans essentially conquered the Minoans, likely after they were already heavily crippled by a large volcanic eruption that happened on one of their main islands. But we didn't expect that they would have had such in-depth trade to have the level of goods and the amount of goods that were found in the Griffin Warrior tomb at the time. So that was very cool information. It's always cool when we can change the dates of what we know, because archaeology is all about gaining more information and learning more and filling in the gaps. So there's going to be a lot of changes as we do learn more. Another very awesome thing about the Griffin Warrior is that his skeleton was almost completely intact, which is very rare for the time period. With the tombs having previously been looted, there was tons of damage to the skeletons at the time, either because of the looting or because the tombs were then left open to the elements or scavengers. Other times it's because the remains were intentionally cremated and then buried as cremains. But luckily for us, this almost completely intact skeleton, which had been damaged once the cover stone fell in over time because of erosion of the sidewalls, a forensic facial reconstruction was able to be done because of his skull being enough intact. And it shows us what people would have looked like of the time period that essentially the Odyssey takes place, or the Iliad, the Trojan War overall. So I think that's very cool. I will definitely share the photo of the facial reconstruction on social media because, again, I think it's very cool. It humanizes the people of the past when we can actually put a face to them instead of just looking at a skull or just their artifacts, or maybe a painting, but it's an artistic rendition in a style that's not very realistic. And we do also know, because of testing that was able to be done and examination of his bones, that the Griffin Warrior was likely in his early 30s and very clearly fought a lot in battles. Some of the artifacts that were found with him were golden daggers and a short sword. I think that was gold, maybe bronze, but very ornate weapons, obviously, a suit of armor. And so all of this is going to be on display at the Getty Villa. And when I do the live stream, I will obviously be sure to point them out. So hence why they call him the Griffin Warrior. And the Griffin part comes from the fact that he was buried with a lot of the grave goods specifically placed in different positions on top of his body whenever he was interred. And one of the earliest things found when they started excavating his skeleton was an ivory plaque that has a griffin on it that was resting between his legs. And in the time period, that's often seen as a very important positioning. And there were also fragments of artifacts that had griffins on them as well, like a mirror that was found that was placed on top of his chest, upper stomach area. Again, I will share a very cool diagram that the archaeologists did when they found it about where all of the artifacts were placed on his body. And there were many layers of grave goods buried with him, like above him, with him, below him, around him. So obviously he was very important for these types of gold, silver, bronze, all sorts of important things to just be buried into the ground forever. He might have been the Wanax of this area before the Palace of Nestor came to be, or at the very least, as I said, possibly the military leader of the time, who, because of the nature of Mycenaean culture and the city-state cultures, they definitely put a huge emphasis on military prowess and importance on military leaders. I'll be doing the live stream of the exhibit this Friday, June 27th, and there will be all sorts of artifacts from the Griffin Warrior's grave and several of the tombs around it and the Palace of Nestor as well. And I'm very excited to see them all. This is the first time that these artifacts have been displayed outside of Europe. So that's also very cool that we actually managed to get that sort of exhibit going here across the pond, as they say. And next, I'm going to actually be interviewing Claire Lyons, the curator at the Getty, who is responsible for bringing this to us, asking her a bit about the timeline, how long it took for her to get this project going, and the level of effort that goes into it and the amount of people involved to get these items on loan from Greece and then be able to actually see them in person here in California. So I'm very excited about it. And if you happen to be in Southern California, either because you live here or you're visiting, I highly recommend checking it out. You'll get to see a firsthand look of the culture that will be shown in the Odyssey movie that's going to come out the summer after the exhibit ends. The exhibit starts, as I said, June 27th, this Friday, and will go until January 12th, 2026. So try to make a point to check it out. I highly recommend it. So next up, please join me for the interview with Claire Lyons. I'm very excited to talk to her about the exhibit and a lot of her favorite artifacts that are going to be on display. So with me today, I have Claire Lyons, who is curator of antiquities at the Getty. And please, Claire, could you tell us a bit more about the specifics of what you do in your job as a curator?
I've been a curator here for a number of years in a fairly big department, and the curator job is really a multilateral one. Primarily, we're here to build the museum's collection of art and artifacts, to interpret and display the objects, and to preserve them on behalf of the public for the long term. So that involves a whole range of activities, from acquisitions to bring objects into the collection, research, publication, and organizing exhibitions. I would say that takes up probably the majority of our time.
Oh, I can bet. So you had mentioned previously that this exhibit specifically, the Kingdom of Pylos, was years in the making. Can you elaborate more on that for us?
Yes, it was. Typically, a big international traveling exhibition like this would be the focus of everybody's activities for at least 3 or 4 years out. In this case, the idea for this particular exploration of the ancient Kingdom of Pylos came up a long time ago after some truly remarkable discoveries that we can talk about. And archaeologists involved gave a lecture here, and I knew instantly, this was probably in 2016, I knew right away we had to do this show. So thinking about it, researching, a little bit of a break during those years of COVID when museums were closed, but we started up again in 2021, and now it's all coming together.
That is very exciting. So when the artifacts were first found, essentially, like, who had them in order to start the organization process of getting them to museums? Who held them first?
Any excavation that takes place in any country, of course, but it's in Greece, in this case, is the responsibility and the property of the nation of Greece. And that material is overseen by a Ministry of Culture. But the actual excavation at Pylos was conducted by archaeologists from the University of Cincinnati. So there's a joint responsibility for studying, excavating, conserving, and publishing these objects, but ultimately decisions regarding where they travel to and how they are shown to the public are taken by the Ministry of Culture. So we began working together with them very early on to explore the possibilities and to get this whole idea going. So it's been a really incredible experience of real generosity and support on behalf of the Greek ministry and the Cincinnati archaeologists, Jack Davis and Sharon Stalker.
Yes, that's awesome. I've just always loved how much the back end work goes into all of this and how many people there are involved before I got into archaeology, I'd never realized that. And actually being able to see it now, I love being able to share that with everyone else. And so in addition to the Ministry of Greece, were there like other curators that you have to be working with in order to plan all of this? Because I know it's going next to a museum in Athens. So how many other people are involved?
Inside and outside of our museum, there are just dozens of people. The ministry is for overseeing different regions, is divided into a number of directorates for each area. And so we worked extremely closely with the Directorate of Antiquities, which is based in Kalamata, Greece, which is the very southernmost part of the Peloponnese. So they are responsible for that region and have archaeologists on staff, conservators. So we're all working together along with the archaeologists and along with other curators to coordinate, curators in Athens, as well as all the specialists. So within our museum, there are dozens of people. Every department in some way is involved. It's a big collaborative group enterprise. And I guess the curator's job is like that of a director coordinating a lot of people and a lot of activities so that everything comes out in the end.
Thank you. That is awesome. Thank you for the insight. And speaking about the exhibit itself, I wanted to see if you could give us some insight about the iconography that's used repeatedly throughout the exhibit, and especially like recurring animals and symbols that are seen throughout a lot of the artifacts.
That's a really great question. And I hinted before at this very important discovery, and that I think you may be, and others who are following you may have read about this. There was international press coverage back in 2015 and 16 when the archaeologist Davidson and Stocker uncovered what has come to be known as the grave of the Griffin Warrior. And this is a Mycenaean burial of a single warrior dating sometime around 1500, 1450 BC that was intact. That is, it was unplundered. And it was filled with, more than 1,500 artifacts. So it's really a priceless record of a moment in time and of a single individual. And it was filled with just remarkable objects that really change our understanding of history at that point in time. So if you look just at that one context, there's a lot of symbolism, a lot of different mythological and animal imagery from the natural world. And this has a meaning. These are important. They're not only decorative items that draw on long artistic traditions. They have meaning in their context. For example, you'll see recurring images of the mythological griffin, that creature which is the feline body with the head of an eagle. And often griffins are seen fighting lions. Lions are very popular imagery because, of course, they stand for everything that they still stand for: bravery, ferocity, and that sort of thing. So to see the two creatures, the sort of dominant creature of the sky, the celestial mythological aspect, and the earthly power of the lion, has to have a meaning, and maybe was an emblem, maybe perhaps a kind of heraldic emblem, because it's recurring on elite objects, on jewelry, on wall paintings that were in the throne rooms of several Mycenaean palaces. So that has, I think, a great deal of significance. And for that reason, this warrior has been called the Griffin Warrior, because he had a very beautiful ivory vessel in his burial with this combat scene of a lion and a griffin. And the lion is winning. So we could think about what that means. But in other aspects, some of the other burials, there are a number of tiny gold appliques, little tiny gold ornaments of animals found in the grave: butterflies, owls, birds, seashells. And these were probably attached to the shroud, to a cloth shroud that was wrapped around the body and were used to decorate it. And it's likely that these kinds of creatures had a funerary and underworld significance. Butterflies, a kind of symbol of transformation, rebirth, regeneration as they grow from caterpillar to butterfly. And also owls. Owls are nocturnal creatures. So is that connected with a kind of underworld resonance. You can read a lot of meaning into these kinds of ornaments.
That is very cool. Thank you. Yeah. And I love that there are like even today, there's the recognizable symbol of butterflies are often still associated with souls and funerals and things like that. And then owls still, like, across lots of different cultures, are associated with the afterlife. So it's always cool to see those common human things where we see the unexplainable and we associate it with the spiritual. So I will definitely be making a point to show off all of the griffins that I can find throughout the exhibit, because there's going to be many, and especially pointing out the griffins fighting the lions for the symbolism there. And I really love the smaller pieces that you mentioned, the appliques. Was any piece of the death shroud still left, or were these just essentially the only thing that remained from the organic?
From there sometimes is evidence. There's no actual linen surviving, but sometimes in some burials there is evidence where the textile has actually mineralized and has adhered to another object. So you can detect its presence, even though the cloth has been substituted, as it were, with the corrosion. So there is evidence of that. And so one has an idea that some bodies, or even perhaps weapons, were wrapped in a special cloth. Yes, that is the case. And that's something that scientists, conservation scientists working with the excavation, are looking very closely at.
That is very cool. In some of my research, I've seen burials where the only thing left was the iron collars, but that we could tell that there were linen wrappings because of the remains of the corrosion that showed that there was linen there. I love that that's, again, one of those things where you can take that and look at other places for those little tiny pieces.
Yeah, that's one of the most exciting parts of this, for me, for archaeology and in museums as well, the science of archaeology and the science of conservation, of examining the materiality of these artifacts, understanding their sources, their manufacturing techniques, and every little aspect, which all goes into the way we like to think about it, that these objects have lives. And you want to trace that life from the moment of their inception up to the present and what they now mean to us today. And there are some pretty wonderful objects in this exhibition where we can do that from beginning to end. And we've made an effort to do that and to tell the scientific background, how archaeologists are really working today.
That is very cool. And so could you give like a specific example of one of the artifacts? Because I'm excited about that sort of stuff.
All right. Well, I have to mention the most famous object from the Griffin Warrior burial, and there are others from some of the other contexts as well. I'll mention two if you don't mind, but from the burial, and this got a great deal of press coverage over the years. There is a small seal stone, a small carved agate. It's known as the Pylos combat agate. And it's a small stone that's pierced and was probably worn with a carved scene on it. And the scene is of two warriors battling each other over the body of a deceased warrior below. It's of such exquisite detail that it's unparalleled among other miniature works. It's about 1.5 inches long. Wow. And if I held it in my hand, just in daylight, it would be difficult to see it. So we need to look at it through microphotography. And then you realize the detail of the bodies, of the anatomy, of the gestures. I don't want to go overboard, but it's truly miraculous. So it raises the question immediately, how was it done? If we can't see it just looking under normal light, how did the artisan create this? So we've made a special display of this, let's use the word masterpiece, okay? And so Definitely. That you can start to see what is on the surface, and then, look through the iPad at what is really there, and then try to understand how an artist can create that with the tools of the era. So I would urge you to visit that piece and see this narrative of this work. That's really important, probably one of the most outstanding works of art from the Aegean prehistoric period that we have. But I also want to emphasize another kind of work, maybe not so beautiful, maybe not at first glance an exquisite work of art, but at the Palace of Nestor at Pylos, which dates for about a century and a half after the Griffin Warrior. It was discovered in 1939 by University of Cincinnati archaeologist Carl Blagan. On his very first day of excavation, he found tablets, inscribed clay tablets, undeciphered at that time. It took a few years to work it out, but it's a very early form of inscription known as Linear B, which is the earliest kind of written Greek language. So this archive, a complete archive of inscribed tablets, tells you about daily life, about religious practices, about the economic organization of the palace and its kingdom. And some of these are just filled with information about people, about workers, about what they're manufacturing, about commodities. And we have 5 of these tablets on display. They were burned when the palace was burned, which is in some way a blessing because the clay turned into terracotta and they're preserved. But one of them is the very famous tripod tablet, and it gave the symbols, the syllables, and what we think of as a pictogram of a tripod that allowed scholars to decipher Linear B and make that connection between the symbol and the Greek word tripode, tripod. So that was the key toward extending Greek history deep back into a prehistoric horizon. So they are priceless, genuinely priceless. So don't forget to make a stop there as well.
I will absolutely be stopping there. That is definitely more my wheelhouse. I love more of the like daily life peaks. Obviously, everybody loves a good like warrior prince and an elaborate tomb, but I've always focused more on the daily lives of as many of the like normal people, so to say, as possible. And I love that's so. As an Egyptologist, I'm going to throw in my comparison. That's essentially the Rosetta Stone for Linear B.
Exactly. That's a perfect parallel. It's the Rosetta Stone for early Greek, and the little logograms, pictograms, I guess someone on my team also joked that they are the emojis of antiquity. I thought that was pretty good.
I think that's a good one too. We're just like circling back in language. We're getting back to that. I love that. Do you have any other favorite artifacts that you might want to highlight from large or small? Obviously, the agate is going to be a stop for sure. It's also the artifact that's featured on the front of the book for the exhibit.
It is. So. Yes, we, and working with our colleagues, Sharon Stalker especially, took special efforts to make new photography and the best possible of this work and of all the works in this exhibition. So that's one of the great features of our collaboration. When you're an archaeologist, you know this. Once you really learn about an object, once you get into its every aspect of its qualities, you love it, right?
Yeah.
So it's hard not to really become attached to these objects. But there's one in particular that I do love. These warrior princes often wore big, solid gold signet rings, really large ones. Griffin Warrior had 4 of them, but there are others as well, and they're particularly well done. One of them comes from another burial, and going back to the animals theme, it has a pair of bulls crouching, and there are stalks of barley around. So it's a rather lovely and endearing scene of these 2 animals, perhaps in a field that's on the face of the signet ring that you might have used to make a seal, to make your own symbol. But looking at those 2 images, what you are seeing are what Jack Davis called the twin pillars of Bronze Age economy: animal husbandry and agriculture. So it's also deeply significant, and you can imagine that the individual who wore that ring was prosperous enough to have it and perhaps to command wide territories of agriculture and herding.
Yeah, so, that is awesome. Yeah, because the ring itself is a sign of wealth, but like the vast agricultural lands or large herds would have also been a major sign of wealth back then too.
For certain. Yes, absolutely.
That is very cool. I will have to make sure to take a stop by and look at that one as well. Obviously, I'm going to look at every artifact, but I don't want to spend too much time on every single one and then we're there for the entire day and I'm kicked out at the end of the day. So since you mentioned the Palace of Nestor, I wanted to ask you, so I didn't know this until you had mentioned it, but you said that Pylos was actually in the recording of the new Christopher Nolan Odyssey.
Yes, it was. Yes, there's going to be a film. We're reading about it. Christopher Nolan is currently filming a version of the Odyssey. I believe it's going to be released summer of 26, so after our exhibition. But some segments of it were filmed this spring in modern day Pylos. And you'll find some bootleg images of, I think, Matt Damon enjoying some seafood there. But it's a perfect landscape for it. There's a wonderful harbor at Boidokilia Bay. And above that harbor, there's a cave, which I think Nolan and his crew transformed into the cave of Polyphemus, the Cyclops. So there's been filming. I gather that they built a replica of a Bronze Age ship. So everybody is really looking forward to it. And I think that with this exhibition, we can give some insights into the society, the late Bronze Age society that in some respects, in certain elements, had influenced and are reflected in the epic poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. There are artifacts that Homer describes. And the Palace of Nestor features, and Nestor himself, the mythological King Nestor, features in both the Iliad and Odyssey. So we'll have a gallery devoted to the excavations of the Palace of Nestor, which became the center of this regional kingdom, not only with the linear bead tablets that I told you about, but with wall paintings and other artifacts of everyday life, of feasting and weaponry and that sort of thing.
I love that. Yeah, that is exciting. So I'm very excited to see the movie and see, obviously, as an archaeologist, I'm going to be a nerd and geek out about like how close they get to things that we know to be like truth and things we don't and things like that. So it'll be very exciting.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I just wanted to thank you again, Claire, for joining me for this episode. And thank you again for sharing all of these insights about curation and the griffins and lions especially, but the iconography within the exhibit. So I wanted to thank you again for joining me for this episode and showing me a bit more about the curation process and what goes into setting up these exhibits. And I will be sure during the live stream to stop by and showcase the artifacts that you've told me about on this episode. And was there anything else that you wanted to share just about curation or the exhibit or anything really?
No, not. There's so much, and I'd love to continue this conversation. But for now, I want to just thank you. It's been a great pleasure to speak with you, Stephanie, and I want to wish you a really interesting and engaging visit for you and all of your followers. This is a uniquely special opportunity. I can say one thing, surprisingly, as famous as Mycenaeans and Minoans are, this is the first exhibition on this topic outside of Europe, the first in North America. And that surprised me when I first realized it, the first major one. So I would really encourage everybody who can to make an effort to come and to follow some of the great online programming that we are organizing throughout the fall.
Yes, definitely. And I will make sure to share any of the other Getty programming that's coming out, that the various online videos and things that y'all are going to be doing. So thank you again, Claire, and have a great day.
Same to you. Thanks all.
Bye. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with new releases. Please leave a rating and a comment. That helps the show reach others who may be interested in the past macabre. For access to bonus content from all Archaeology Podcast Network shows, become a member at archpodnet.com/members. That's archpodnet.com/members. You can find show notes for this and other episodes at archpodnet.com/TPM and follow Past Macabre on Instagram. That's PAST_MACABRE. You'll find pictures of the sites and artifacts discussed, Q&A sessions, and episode topic votes. Hope to see you there.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.